At 3:17 p.m. on a Tuesday, the doorbell of 1247 Maple Street rang for the first time in 5 years. I watched through the window as my parents stood on the porch they'd sold to pay for my sister's wedding, holding flowers and what looked like an apology letter. They had no idea I was the one who would answer. And in 30 seconds when I opened that door, their faces would go whiter than the wedding dress that cost me my childhood sanctuary. Where are you watching from right now? If you've ever lost something precious to someone else's priorities, hit subscribe. This story is about taking back what was never theirs to give away. My name is Jessica Morrison. I'm 31 years old, and I've been planning this moment for exactly 5 years, 2 months, and 16 days. The moment when my parents would realize that the daughter they'd overlooked had quietly become the person holding the keys to everything they'd lost. But let me take you back to where the story really begins, in the house at 1247 Maple Street. The Victorian that had been in our family for 3 generations, where I'd spent the first 26 years of my life believing it would always be home. Our family looked perfect from the outside. Dad, Robert Morrison, was a successful insurance agent who'd built Morrison and Associates into a respected firm. Mom, Patricia, came from old Connecticut money and brought through the kind of social connections that opened country club doors and charity board positions. They lived well, not extravagantly, but comfortably, in our 4-bedroom Victorian with the wraparound porch and the garden that had been featured in Better Homes and Gardens. My sister Emma was 28 then, the golden child who'd followed every prescribed path. Sorority president at Yale, marketing manager at a boutique agency, engaged to Preston Whitfield III, whose family name carried enough weight to make our parents glow with pride at dinner parties. Emma was beautiful, charming, and exactly what our parents had always envisioned in a daughter. Then there was me. I'd graduated from UConn with a degree in environmental science, spent 2 years with the EPA, then started my own environmental consulting firm. While Emma collected wedding magazines, I collected soil samples and wrote impact reports. While she planned Pinterest-perfect gatherings, I helped corporations navigate complex environmental regulations. My work was important, but it wasn't glamorous. It didn't photograph well for Christmas cards. The Victorian on Maple Street had been our anchor for 90 years. My great-grandmother bought it in 1934. My grandmother raised 4 children there, and my parents had continued the tradition. Every room held memories. The 3rd floor reading nook where I'd spent countless hours, the kitchen where 3 generations had gathered for holidays, the garden where I'd learned to love growing things. I always assumed I'd inherit it someday, or at least have the option to buy it from the estate. It was the kind of assumption you make about permanent things, like the sun rising or your parents loving you unconditionally. I was wrong about both. The announcement came during Sunday dinner in March, 5 years ago. Emma was in full wedding planning mode, stress-eating her way through Mom's pot roast while scrolling through venue options on her tablet. "The Whitfield Club wants $50,000 for the reception alone," Emma said, not looking up from her screen. "That's just the base package. Flowers, photography, catering. We're looking at another $75,000 minimum." Dad set down his fork. "Emma, sweetheart, that's more than we discussed." "Daddy, this is the wedding of a lifetime. Preston's family has connections. They're going back 4 generations. We can't have the ceremony anywhere less appropriate." Mom reached over to squeeze Emma's hand. "Of course not, darling. We'll figure something out." That's when Dad cleared his throat, the same throat clearing that had preceded major family announcements my entire life. "Actually, your mother and I have been discussing our options. We've decided to put the house on the market." The words hit me like ice water. "What do you mean, put the house on the market?" "We're selling, Jessica. The real estate market is strong right now, and this house has appreciated significantly. We can downsize to something more manageable, and use the equity to give Emma the wedding she deserves." I stared at him. "You're selling our family home? The house that's been in our family for 90 years? For a wedding?" Emma finally looked up from her tablet. "Jess, don't be dramatic. It's just a house." "Just a house?" I felt something crack inside my chest. "Emma, this is where we grew up. Where great-grandma lived. Where every major moment of our lives happened. And now it'll help create the most important moment of mine," she said, smiling at Preston, who nodded approvingly. Mom jumped in with her peacekeeper voice. "Jessica, you have to understand. Emma's wedding is an investment in our family's future, the connections she'll make, the doors this will open. What about my future?" I asked. "What about the assumption that someday I might want to raise my own children in this house?" Dad's expression hardened. Jessica, you're 31 and single. You work in environmental consulting, which barely covers your apartment rent. Be realistic about your prospects. The dismissal was so casual, so complete, that it took my breath away. Emma went back to scrolling through wedding vendors. Preston checked his phone. Mom started clearing dishes as if the conversation was over. But it wasn't over for me. How much do you need? I asked quietly. What? Dad looked confused. For Emma's wedding. How much money do you actually need? Emma answered without looking up. 150,000 should cover everything properly. And you think selling the house is the only way to get that money? Dad sighed. Jessica, your mother and I have already explored other options. This is the most practical solution. I excused myself from the table and went upstairs to the reading nook where I'd spent so many childhood hours. My laptop was still in my old room. I'd been working on a proposal for a major client while visiting for the weekend. I opened it and pulled up my business accounts. Morrison Environmental Consulting had been more successful than my parents realized. Much more successful. In 3 years I'd built a client base that included 2 Fortune 500 companies and a dozen municipalities. My contracts were worth $2.30 million annually, and my business account held $847,000 in cash reserves. I could write Emma a check for her wedding tomorrow and still have enough left for 6 months of operating expenses. But as I sat in that reading nook, looking out at the garden where I'd learned to love the natural world, I realized something important. I didn't want to save Emma's wedding. I wanted to save our home. And I had an idea that would do both, while teaching my family a lesson about assumptions they'd never forget. The next morning, I called my attorney. Jennifer, I need you to set up a shell corporation. Something discreet that can make real estate purchases without revealing the actual buyer. Jennifer Walsh had been handling my business legal work for 2 years. She was sharp, thorough, and asked exactly the right questions. How discreet are we talking, Jessica? Completely anonymous. The sellers should have no idea who's actually buying. What's the property? 1247 Maple Street in Westport. It's going on the market next week. She was quiet for a moment. Isn't that your family home? It was. 3 days later, Maple Holdings LLC was incorporated in Delaware with Jennifer as the registered agent. My parents listed the house with Morrison Realty. The irony wasn't lost on me that they were using Dad's own firm to sell our family heritage. The asking price was $875,000. I authorized Jennifer to offer $925,000 cash, contingent on a 2-week closing, and the current owners being allowed to remain as month-to-month renters until they found new accommodations. My parents were ecstatic about the mystery buyer who'd offered $50,000 over asking price with no financing contingencies. Dad spent the closing dinner bragging about his negotiating skills and the investment buyers who recognized quality real estate. Emma got her dream wedding at the Whitfield Club. The photos were spectacular. Her dress cost more than most people's cars, and the reception featured orchids flown in from Thailand. She looked radiant, Preston looked proud, and my parents glowed as they introduced themselves as the Whitfields' new in-laws. I attended as the supportive sister, smiled in family photos, and gave a heartfelt maid of honor speech about love and family bonds. I never mentioned that I'd essentially paid for the entire celebration through my shell company's generous offer on our childhood home. That night, after the last guest left and the cleanup crew finished, I drove past 1247 Maple Street, one final time before my parents moved out. The windows were dark, but I could see the outline of the wraparound porch and the silhouette of the oak tree I'd climbed as a child. I'll take care of you, I whispered to the house. I promise. 2 weeks later, my parents moved into a modern townhouse, 15 minutes away. They'd downsized significantly, but maintained their dignity and their social standing. Emma and Preston honeymooned in Tuscany, posting Instagram photos of their perfect life. And I began the quiet work of restoring everything my family had sold. My first call was to Margaret Henley, the interior designer who'd helped my grandmother redecorate the house in the 1980s. Margaret was 73 now, but still working, and she understood immediately what I wanted to accomplish. You want to restore it exactly as it was when your family lived there? Not exactly. I want to restore the soul of it while making it mine. Over the next 6 months, Margaret and I worked to honor the house's history while adapting it for contemporary life. We restored the original hardwood floors, updated the kitchen with period-appropriate but modern appliances, and converted the basement. into a home office where I could run my growing consulting business. The reading nook became my private sanctuary, with built-in bookshelves and a window seat that overlooked the garden. I hired a landscape architect to restore my great-grandmother's original garden design using heritage plants and sustainable practices. Most importantly, I had a security system installed with cameras that would record anyone who came to the door. I never told my parents I owned a house. When they asked about my living situation, I said I was renting a place in Westport and changed the subject. When they drove past their old home and saw lights in the windows, I told them the new owners seemed to be taking good care of the property. For 5 years, I lived quietly in the house they'd sold, building my business, hosting friends, and creating the life I'd always imagined having there. My consulting firm expanded to include environmental impact assessments for major developments, and my annual revenue grew to $3.70 million. But more than the financial success, I found peace in restoring our family home. Every room told a story, and now those stories included my own chapter as the protector who'd brought it back to life. The doorbell rang at 3:17 p.m. on a Tuesday 5 years later, because my parents had finally hit rock bottom. Emma's marriage to Preston had ended in an expensive divorce after 18 months. She'd moved back in with our parents, who discovered that their downsized lifestyle and reduced expenses hadn't accounted for supporting an adult child indefinitely. Dad's insurance business had struggled during the pandemic, losing several major clients to larger firms that could offer better rates. Mom's inheritance from her own parents had been smaller than expected, eaten up by healthcare costs and poor investments. They needed help. Financial help, emotional help, and somewhere to turn when their perfect life plan fell apart. So they came to the house they'd sold, hoping the mysterious new owners might be willing to sell it back to them below market value. They'd practiced their speech about family heritage and sentimental value, and would the owners please consider letting the Morrison family return to their ancestral home. What they didn't know was that the mysterious new owners had been planning this moment for 5 years. I watched them through the security camera as they approached the front door. Dad looked older, grayer, more uncertain than I'd ever seen him. Mom clutched a bouquet of flowers, daffodils from the grocery store, not the elaborate arrangements she used to favor. They rang the doorbell and waited nervously on the porch where they'd welcomed thousands of guests over the years. I took a deep breath, smoothed my dress, and opened the door. "Hi, Mom." "Hi, Dad. What brings you to my house?" The flowers fell from Mom's hands and scattered across the porch. Steps. Dad's mouth opened and closed without sound. They stood frozen in the doorway, staring at me as if I were a ghost haunting their former home. "Jessica?" Mom whispered finally. "What are you doing here? I live here." "This is my house." "That's impossible," Dad said, his voice cracking. "We sold this house 5 years ago to Maple Holdings." I smiled. "That's right. You sold it to my company. I bought our family home with the money I made from the environmental consulting business you said barely covered my rent." They stared at me in complete shock. Mom grabbed Dad's arm for support. "You bought the house?" she asked. "With what money? How?" "With the $150,000 I could have given Emma for her wedding, plus the additional funds I've earned building a multi-million-dollar consulting business over the past 5 years. Dad's face went white. Multi-million-dollar? $3.7 million in annual revenue, to be precise. I specialize in environmental impact assessments for major developments. Turns out there's excellent money in helping corporations avoid the kind of regulatory problems that could cost them hundreds of millions. I gestured toward the interior of the house, where they could see the carefully restored rooms that honored our family's history while reflecting my own taste and success. "Would you like to come in? I've made some improvements to our family home." They followed me inside like sleepwalkers, taking in the restored hardwood floors, the updated but period-appropriate fixtures, the family photos I'd kept, and the new ones I'd added documenting my own life in the house. "You've been living here for 5 years?" Mom asked, running her hand along the banister they'd walked past thousands of times. 5 years, 2 months, and 16 days. Since the week after Emma's wedding. Dad sank into the living room chair he'd occupied every Sunday for 26 years. "Why didn't you tell us?" "Because you needed to learn something about assumptions. About dismissing people based on limited information. About sacrificing permanent things for temporary celebrations." Mom was crying now, soft tears that she tried to hide behind her hand. "Jessica, we had no idea you were so successful. You never said anything." I tried to tell you about my business, but you weren't interested in listening. You assumed that because my work wasn't glamorous, it wasn't valuable. You assumed that because I wasn't married, I couldn't build a life worth living. You assumed wrong about everything. Dad looked around the room, at the family photos, at the restored furniture, at the home they'd given up for one perfect day. You could have stopped us from selling, he said quietly. You had the money to pay for Emma's wedding without touching the house. Yes, I could have. But then you never would have learned what you lost. And I never would have had the chance to save what mattered most. We sat in silence for several minutes. Mom walked around the room, touching familiar objects, examining the changes I'd made with care and respect for the house's history. Emma's marriage didn't last, she said finally. I know. I saw the divorce announcement in the paper. She's been living with us for 2 years. Our townhouse isn't big enough for 3 adults, and money's been tight since your father lost the Henderson account. Dad looked up sharply. How did you know about the Henderson account? I know about most of what's happened to you over the past 5 years. This is a small town, and people talk. I also know that you came here today. Ask the new owners if they'd sell the house back to you below market value because of its sentimental importance to your family. They both stared at me. The house is worth $1.3 million now, given the improvements I've made, and the current market conditions. But I'm not interested in selling it. This is my home. Jessica, Dad said, his voice breaking slightly. We made a terrible mistake. We should never have sold this house. We should never have dismissed your success or assumed you couldn't build something meaningful. You're right. You made terrible mistakes. Is there any way could we work something out? Some kind of arrangement where we could move back in, maybe as tenants? I looked at my parents, really looked at them for the first time in years. They were smaller than I remembered, more fragile, humbled by the consequences of their choices. There's a guest suite above the garage, I said finally. It's furnished and has its own entrance. If you're genuinely interested in rebuilding our relationship, if you're willing to treat me as an equal rather than your disappointing daughter, we could discuss a rental arrangement. Hope flickered in their eyes. But there would be conditions. You'd be my tenants, paying market rent. Emma would need to find her own housing. I'm not running a halfway house for failed marriages. And most importantly, you'd need to genuinely want to understand who I am and what I've built, instead of just tolerating me until you can get back to your preferred version of our family. Dad nodded slowly. Those terms seem fair. Mom? She wiped her eyes and managed a small smile. I'd like to understand who my daughter really is. I think I've missed a lot. That evening, we sat around the kitchen table where our family had shared thousands of meals, and I told them about my business. Really told them, with specifics about clients and projects, and the satisfaction of solving complex environmental challenges. They listened like they'd never listened before. Dad asked intelligent questions about regulatory compliance. Mom wanted to know about the travel my work required and whether I'd ever considered expanding internationally. For the first time in my adult life, they saw me as a person with expertise, opinions, and achievements worth understanding. 2 weeks later, they moved into the guest suite above the garage. Emma found an apartment across town and began the work of rebuilding her own life without the safety net of other people's expectations. 6 months after that conversation on the porch, we'd established a new family dynamic based on mutual respect rather than old assumptions. Dad occasionally consulted with me on insurance matters related to environmental liability. It turned out my expertise complemented his business knowledge in useful ways. Mom joined the garden club and helped me maintain great-grandmother's restored landscaping. She'd never shown interest in gardening before, but she discovered a talent for it that surprised us both. Most importantly, they learned to see me as I actually was rather than as they'd always assumed I should be. If you're still watching at this point, drop sanctuary in the comments so I know who caught the real meaning of this story. The lesson I learned from reclaiming my childhood home wasn't about revenge. It was about the difference between being seen and being understood. For years I'd wanted my parents to see my success, to validate my choices, to approve of my life. But what I actually needed was for them to understand who I was and what mattered to me. Understanding requires curiosity, humility, and the willingness to admit when your assumptions were wrong. Recognition is something you demand through undeniable achievement. Understanding is something you earn through patient, honest relationships with people who choose to really know you. My parents had to lose their home to understand what they'd never bothered to learn about their daughter. I had to buy it back to create the space where real family relationships could grow. The house at 1247 Maple Street isn't just my sanctuary now. It's the place where our family learned the difference between assumptions and truth, between appearances and reality, between the relationships we perform and the ones we actually build. Diet. Tell me about the moment your family finally saw who you really were. Was it through success, crisis, or something else entirely? And if they still don't see you clearly, what would it take for them to understand?